I'm Ken Duncan, Head Brewer at Inveralmond Brewery, and it's lovely to welcome you here.
Thank you very much. Well, we actually, for a weekend, myself and my wife is filming, and we're meant to be, that's Christine, thank you very much. We're meant to be in Percy Centre having a few beers just now, but I could not resist coming to the Inveralmond Brewery, and Ken is kindly going to show us around and just say hello.
That's it. And what I always like to say to people, Alastair, at the beginning of a little tour to the brewery is, welcome to the wonderful world of beer. To some, a dream, to others, a nightmare. Thank you, Merlin. But what we have here is our lovely Inveralmond Brewery. We've been going for 15 years now, but we moved to this site 2 years ago and did our first brew last January, January the previous year. And what we have is a 50 hectolitre brew house, which means each brew that we can do is 50 hectolitres, 5,000 litres. I've never quite worked what that is in pints, but in old speak it's 30 brewers' barrels. So it's a 30 barrel brew house. And what we have behind us is the hot liquor tank. Liquor is what we make the beer from, it's water in other words, but hot liquor is what we make the beer from. Water is what we generally wash the floor with.
That's right, yes.
So it's a subtle difference between the two. So we have hot liquor tank over here. It's probably best if you stay there because you get an overview of it. So
yes.
This hot liquor tank, they're insulated. And then this one is our cold water tank, or cold liquor tank, which will become the hot liquor once it's been through the process and we've saved the heat from the brew. So cold and hot. And here we have the mash tun in here. And this is where we mix the grist, the ground malt, which are all these big white sacks. Just over to your right, as the camera pans gently. Always pan gently, don't do it quickly. It makes people giddy. And this is the mash tun, where we mix the crushed malt, which we crush in our mill, up the stairs, and then it comes down, the malt comes down, the grist comes down, and we mix it with hot water at about 75 degrees in here. So we end up with a big orangey mixture, the mash, at 65 to 68 degrees, depending on the actual brew. And inside the mash tun, the magic of starch conversion. The starch dissolves in hot water, and the enzymes in the malt will turn the starch into sugars. Not white sugar, but malt sugars, which are a very wide spectrum of sugars. And all we do inside the mash tun then is to drain off the liquid, which we call wort. And it's the colour of the beer, and we drain it off very, very slowly over about 3 to 4 hours and pump it into our brew kettle, which is this big tank here with the little window at the top so we can see what's happening at the top. And we fill the wort up into the kettle, just up to about halfway up the window, and that's 30 barrels of wort. And then we put in our hops. And over here I've got a little sample of what we're using, and that's what hops look like. I'll come a bit closer. You can see that they're basically flowers, the dried flowers of...
But what kind of hop is that one?
This one is actually a hop called Styrian Golding. We actually don't use them in this form, we use them ground up a bit more. But that's what they are, and they're the flower of the hop vine. They grow about 20-25 feet tall, Jack and the Beanstalk style.
All right.
And these are the flowers, and at the base of the petals, what we have is you might be able to make out a sort of yellowish tinge.
Oh, I see it, yeah.
And that yellowish tinge surrounds the seed, and that yellowish tinge is basically the resins, the sticky resins and essential oils in the hops, and that's what makes beer bitter when we boil it in the wort. And also
the more hops, the more bitter it is.
The more hops, the more bitter.
And the more different types of hops you use.
Exactly. There's hundreds of different varieties of hops, and so you can have hops which are very bitter, and you can have hops which are very aromatic, lots of essential oils.
And so I hear getting used quite a lot just now is an American citrus.
Citra.
Citra, sorry.
That's one of the, there's hops like Cascade, which we use in Ossian. That's where it gets its sort of citrus orangey flavour from. And then there's hops like Amarillo. Not Take Me to Amarillo, but Do You Know the Way?
Do You Know the Way?
But Amarillo, which is another American hop. Citra again, another American hop, and they're very, very high in these sort of citrus characters.
Sort of lemony.
Well, Citra will give you sort of a grapefruit flavour in the beer. It's not my personal preference, but I'm not brewing beers for me. I'm brewing beer for the great public out there who just love good flavours. And so we use about 12 different varieties of hops in our beers. Some beers will have just one hop variety, and others will have maybe 5 or 6 different varieties.
Just the blend, probably.
It's what sort of flavour are we trying to give that particular beer. So we put the bittering hops in at the beginning of the boil. We're called brewers because we boil. Brewing is boiling. I'll put a brew on, meaning we'll put a cup of tea on. We'll put the kettle on so we can have a cup of tea or a coffee, or hot chocolate in my case. Dave likes tea. So we brew, and this is the brew kettle over here, where we actually boil up the wort with the hops, and we're talking 30 barrels of wort boiling away, and we'll put in maybe 4 to 6 kilos of hop flowers. To get the bitterness out of the hops over about an hour to 80, 90 minutes of boiling. The boiling process does lots of chemical things, or not chemical, but lots of reactions happen in the boil. But the main thing is that we end up with a sterilized or sterile wort, which we could then add our own yeast to create the fermentation, and to make sure that we boil off or boil away any haze-forming proteins, so that we end up with clear,
not cloudy
wort. Cloudy. Because we're all drinking out of glass nowadays, clarity is an issue. So we have to brew to make clear beer. At the end of the boil, I'll turn off the steam heated, and then we throw in maybe 10 to 15 kilos of aromatic hop flowers, and that's where we get the essential oils, such as the citrusy aromas in Ossian, or the more spicy aromas of Sats hops in our Independence and Fundy.
I think half the flavour comes through the nose anyway, doesn't it? It's just kind of.
Well, you can taste 90% of the beer just with your nose. So all I need to do is drink 10%. But what we have to when it comes to tasting beer, we have to actually drink a little bit. We have to swallow a small amount, because we don't taste bitterness except at the back of the throat. So we have to actually swallow the beer. It's a shame.
It's a hard life.
But professionally speaking, when it comes to tasting, when we're tasting every day, I'll probably drink half a pint a week as a professional. As an amateur, well, I'll plead the Fifth Amendment, as they say. But moderation is the key to golden happiness.
Absolutely.
So after the boil, what we do is the hops stay behind. There's a big sieve in the bottom of this, and the hops stay behind. They go off with the spent grain from the mash tun for cattle feed. And we then take the hot liquid, the hot bittersweet wort, and cool it down, and that's where we get the heat from to make our cold liquor into hot liquor. It goes through a heat exchanger, basically. And you've got cold water going this way, and the hot wort goes that way, and the heat will pass to the coldest thing.
So not only good for economics, but good for the environment.
Good for the environment, exactly. So we conserve that energy. And we go over to our fermenters, we have 8 fermenters of this type, and we add our wort, which we cool down to 18.5 degrees Celsius, and then we add about 10 to 15 kilos of yeast. Think of a loaf of bread. When you make it at home, that's 7 grams of yeast. So it's a bucket full of yeast of our own special brewing yeast, and that gives the Inveralmond flavour to our beers.
It's not like a sort of closely guarded secret, is it?
It's not a closely guarded secret, but it makes lovely bread, by the way, and fantastic beer. And it's a strain that we have been using at Inveralmond ever since we started. So
you take your culture from the last one or something like that?
We repitch from each week. I select the best performing fermentation, and I'll select whichever brew it will be, and we'll just take off enough yeast for the next week's brew. Next week's brews. So what that means is that we're taking yeast off every week, and reusing it. The generations go up and up, and I think we're up to the 565th generation. In other words, we've been using that particular strain of yeast or that culture for 565 weeks. That's a long time.
That's a long time. That's what, almost 2 years.
It's 11 to 12 years.
Yes.
There's only 52
Sorry,
weeks in
sorry.
most years that I know.
Well, edit that back out.
I wish I hadn't said that.
So we reuse the yeast and reculture. So what that means is that we have to be very, very careful with our sanitation and our cleanliness. And the old brewing expression is that cleanliness is next to godliness. And it's very, very true in brewing, because if you don't keep your tanks and everything clean, that the wort and the beers we touch, you're going to end up with some sort of infection which will ruin
really
the
change
flavour,
the flavour
and it will ruin the yeast. So we have to be very, very careful about that. So I'm a bit of a cleanliness freak. But that's the way it is in the wonderful world of beer. The fermentation takes 4 days at 18.5 degrees, and after that we cool the beer down to 6 degrees for 3 days. And then we just decant, basically. Our tanks have a valve at this height and one at the very bottom. The green beer, as we call it, or the young beer, or sometimes rough beer, is taken off here and goes over to our conditioning tanks, which are these black and silver vessels on the other side of the room. And there the beer will mature for up to a week, in fact, because when you're making ale, it's a quick process. It's basically 1 week of fermentation and 1 week of conditioning, and then all we do is rack the beer into casks and off to the pub.
A nice fresh brew.
Well, that's the plan.
Yeah. I think beer always tastes best when it's fresher.
Well, that's the thing. Fresh beer is best, absolutely.
Yeah,
and if I had one, I'd be drinking one.
Yeah.
So, cheers.
Well, I'll say thank you very much on the video for telling us that.
No,
and,
pleasure.
Giving us your time, and we'll post this online and see what comments we get back.
Great stuff. Thanks a lot, Nick.